Personal experiences in the form of stories are an excellent way for us to learn as a wildland fire organization. In conjunction with the Achieving the Learning Organization Interagency After Action Review Workshop of November 2003, 7 fire management officers shared some of their cumulative experiences and lessons learned from their several decades of combined experience managing prescribed burns and fire use events. Special thanks to Brett Fay, Kim Soper, Rod Dykehouse, Larry Floyd, Greg Vergari, Lisa Elenz, and Larry McCoy for sharing their knowledge with the wildland fire community.
One of the questions I've got, and it sounds like everybody's been burning for a while, and a lot of us are at the point we need some additional assignments to keep our quals. How many of us haven't lost the burn? So it looks like we're the majority of folks, everybody here has lost a burn at one time or another. Just curious on from those burns that have escaped, have we learned more from those, or the ones that are successful, or do the things sink in more? Or what are some of the lessons that we could learn from the ones that have escaped? I'll start off a small fire we had last year. I wasn't the burn boss on it, I was a program manager. Some of the things looking back on those, I think overall was a success, but some of the stuff I learned about those is some of the parameters that I didn't think were important are very, very important. The first one was the public. Large fires, complex fires, public might be fine with these 1-2 day events, but you go on for a while. You better think about that initially and get that public information ramped up a lot more than you might have you thought it necessary before. Because folks, especially complex, long duration fires, fire use including, if you don't have that ramped up, and it costs money to do, and in a good organization to implement that information, then it's going to bite you in the end. Even though everything on the ground's going just the way you'd want, safety's out there just right, you get this something coming in from left field, and the public political pressure makes it so you got to do something different. So just recently, and I'm trying to carry that message forward. It's hard, it's a tough one to maintain though, because if you do burn in and you don't get much public scrutiny, your level of interest or level of effort going into that public information might be that, it'll be okay. We don't, we'll just put something in the paper instead of setting up booths and things like that. So it's kind of a success and a lesson learned in recent times for me. I don't know if the, escape fires give us more information or things that sit home better than successes. I think sometimes for me they do, because they last a little bit longer, but not sure.
Remember everyone.
You do always remember them. You can remember their name.
Everything you've been involved with, and I think more and more after the last 4 or 5 years, the public information is a critical element of, just getting out and educating folks too on why we're doing it, and if things go bad, you just gotta, still provide that education and information. Otherwise, it's the public scrutiny is on us all.
Fire use events, same thing. I mean, it sounds like a lot of folks been doing fire use this year. That those fire use events, even though they may be in the back 40, to keep that in front of the public is not only a program sort of thing to make sure people know why we're doing it, but it's something that can slide right past you. It's not operational, it's not critical to the safety of the folks on the ground, but it is one of those left field things that will come in and grab you.
If we're talking about that, to me, that's more of a program manager level. Not the burn boss. That's at the level of the forest or at a district that does a lot of fuels, or fuels management, because burn boss has enough that day. He or she could have made the contacts on the burn plan, and if they're chartered to do that, or maybe there's somebody like prevention officer or somebody at the forest level said, hey, we're going to burn, they let the papers know. But then you get something whether the burn escaped or not. You might have a smoke incident or whatever, and it comes to town, and all of a sudden the phone's ringing off the hook, and
Yeah.
so it's something that at the burn boss level, I think we put too much at that level and walk away from the burn boss.
But the question I've got is, if they don't do it or make sure it's done, how do you ensure that gets done? That's what happened to me. That I thought maybe somebody was taking care of that and to the level it was needed. If the burn boss doesn't make sure, is it the line officer's responsibility? Is it the program manager?
Well, we did in KIBAB, and I kind of thought it was a waste of money at the time, but it's paid off big with, is we actually filled a fire information officer and fire at the district level, and that's her job. It's a PFT position, and at first I was, it was because of the money we had from the National Fire Plan, and I was wondering about the value of it, but some of the things we've been doing, you're exactly right. We don't even think about fire information anymore because it's almost fire information overload for us, because she sends us everything that she's putting out, and it's just constantly, just always out talking to the people that are giving us problems about smoke, and because we do have, we've been FOIA'd and we've been litigated on some of our smoke, and we've got a lawyer in town that is just always on us anytime we put smoke in the air. But anyway, with congressional reviews and the whole 9 yards, but she has got in there and just taken that and wrote the letters and did all that kind of stuff, and it's like I wasn't even thinking about fire information, and the reason is because we did fill that position, but it is a full-time position. It's costs, and if the money stays here, it'll be a good position. If it doesn't, like in the old days, then be something I have to go back and look at. But you're exactly right. It's nice to have that position, so we don't have to even worry about it.
We have the same thing. We have an education information person, and it definitely has helped. And it's not only the times when something goes wrong that you want them out there. If we don't start letting the public know what we're doing, why we're doing it, how people fight fires, and all that, we're never gonna have them understand what we're doing. I mean, we constantly change the name of what we call things, and how we go about funding it, and every time we feed a different bill to the public, and if we don't have somebody out there that's trying to help them make that link and make that leap to what we're really doing on the ground, we're never going to get anywhere. I mean, yeah, it's great when something's not going the way you want it to have them there already, but at the same time, we have to get people to understand what we're doing out there, and it's been really helpful for our program, and she helps Rod on the north end some too on the BT.
That's just one aspect. I think the benefit and I'm going to speak for Region 6, and I think it was probably the same back in the days of the logging days, and what had happened to us was we were burning on one unit. We would burn multiple acres a day, or units a day. At one time, to give you a perspective, there was 125 active timber logging units at LeGrand District, 125. Now, of those, you might have been able to burn 40 a year. So there was a lot of activity. So one thing we learned from that, lessons learned, was that the prescribed fire manager job was a very important thing, because you couldn't have, if you had 3 or 4 burn bosses working on that unit, you soon found out that they would be overloaded if they had to take care of all of the contacts on their burn plan, all of the smoke management. So what you did was, you took the prescribed fire manager on that unit to bump up a level, to monitor all the plans, and abdicated some of those responsibilities out of the burn plan. Smoke management, contingency, notifications of the public, and that relieved so that the burn bosses can concentrate on the prescription, the objectives, and how the burn would go that day. Now, what I see wrong on a lot of the things is, you get a forest that might only do maybe 3 or 4 units on the forest. They might only do 2 burns. They might only do it once every 3 years. So there's a lag there, and and pretty soon, every 2 years, a burn boss gets like somebody was saying, a 72-page burn plan, and can they do that all and cipher that all? So I think on whether it's type 1 or 2 burn, I think we need to get that prescribed fire manager position up and take some of those duties off, because we've all heard from these folks here, and that how important just having an information officer could relieve that public pressure.
It's funny because we've all identified it as something that's got to be done, and maybe at different levels of complexity it has a different level of input needed. You know, you're talking about a program manager that kind of oversees that.
Yes.
You've got a dedicated position, you've got a shared position that handles that. So we're kind of all over the board. And I get back to my question, so who is responsible ultimately for tracking that through? I mean, to make sure, is it in the planning stage that you make sure that that's clear, that that information is done? And then, okay, so in my plan says that the burn boss will take care of that information. Now, as you're making that good for Gary face there, you know, that's an overload for that position. Is it, isn't it? I don't know. But with the other positions that have dedicated folks, then it's already taken care of. Or a program manager. So we have different ways of getting at it. But the key thing is, it needs to be done, especially on complex burns. You know, one of the things I jotted down just listening to the four of you about it was maybe there's a complexity analysis for information that needs to be completed as part of the burn plan. That depending on the amount of scrutiny, the type of message you're trying to get out, the level of information, and whether it's a program or a prescribed fire manager or a dedicated position or a forest or a district, something like that, it may end up at different places. But that takes it from the planning stage to define how it's going to happen. For us, that's a problem because we aren't very good at defining how much we need to get out there and who's going to do it. It always goes back to the burn box.
Yeah.
And as you said, they don't have time. They shouldn't be worrying about that as much as other things, because I think from a program standpoint, they need to be worried about safety and the effectiveness of lighting the ground on fire. But they should have a mechanism so that information does get out and is taken care of. So good. Let's. I think we hit the information pretty well. What other success stories, prescribed fire use assignments, things like that, folks might want to share off the information? I think we've gotten that one pretty well taken care of.
Well, I have to get kind of detailed. I'm that kind of guy, and it's kind of a combination, not a success and a success. And I have to set the stage. Bear with me on this. It was a prescribed fire that we were using a helitorch to basically blow out some south aspect PJ. On the north aspect, the plan was to utilize the high fuel moistures on that north aspect to basically stop it. It'll putz around. So we did that in, like, I think the 1st of April. Laid waste as best we could with the helitorch, and it just wasn't working. I mean, it was like 40 degrees and kind of overcast. So I called it off. I didn't call the project shut down because I wanted to wait till conditions came back into play. And so it sat for like 5 weeks, and we had 2 weeks of very cold temperatures, some snow, and I was about to just say, okay, it's a done deal. We'll have to start over again some other time. And then about, I think it was late May, somebody said, well, we got a little smoke up on the top of the ridge. They went and checked it out, and it was apparently somehow, some of that helitorch burn had stayed residual in a punky log or something, but it was established on the north side now. I thought, well, that's no big deal. We did have a secondary fuel treatment back there. So we just kind of lit it. I treated it like a fire use event. Okay, we had a lightning strike up there, and we have fire use on the forest. So we just kind of started managing it like that, just monitoring basically. Well, as it moved deeper into this heavy fuel load, and there were some structures down on that side, I said, well, I guess we've got to start actively managing this. And we could only burn it because the conditions, we had a drought year. The only way we could maintain any control of it was only light at night. So it was a 24-hour operation for many days. And what it turned into was I was the burn boss from I was the burn boss the whole time, but I was out there from like 1 o'clock in the afternoon till 6 or 7 in the morning. That's when we would light. Part of it that we lit was kind of a mid-slope road. And, I was taking it down this road, letting it back down as effectively could to reduce the stringers. Well, as I was going down the road about 2 o'clock in the morning one night, I knew that at some point it was going to reach this where the road kind of looped around, and I didn't want to take the fire to that point at night and then not really have a real problem for the holding boss to deal with the next day. So I stopped short. Well, then I got a call about noon the next day, woke me up and said, hey, we got a big problem. And he said, well, it's blown out on us. And I thought, well, it couldn't have blown out that bad. I mean, that road was ways off. So as I'm driving up, I pull around the corner and there's this huge column. And, you know, it really hit me hard. So what had happened was where I stopped lighting, it had gone down like we had anticipated, but it had fingered, there must have been some kind of upslope something at night, which never happened before, and it had established itself at the base of that loop down there and got established and then blew out and crossed the road and escaped and all that stuff. The lessons learned that I wish I'd had this process, because there were so many lessons learned in that for me that weren't shared. And that first off, I myself, as burn boss, should have thought about that possibility and maybe taken it all the way to the road and just, or the hook in the road, and said, and relayed to the burn boss, or the holding boss, you need to watch that area. But what I had done is the eastern end was still uncontained, but it wasn't moving much, and so I gave him the direction before I knew about this escape. You need to get a good line in down there just to cover our butts down there, because that's where my concern was. It wasn't going this way. So that's what he did. He drove right by. He said he saw this finger kind of established below that hook in the road, but he said, you told me my direction was to get this line on the other side. You know, I should have expressed, first off, you know, get a feel for where your problem areas are, then go deal with that. But he just took it. He was a very, you know, objective-driven guy. I told you to go do this, so that's what he did first, and he let this thing get a little more established. And I shouldn't have stopped where I did with that fire. And that was not shared. And it was such a training opportunity or learning opportunity that I really, I regret that I did not take advantage of that.
I think that's one of the complexities. There's a lot of them, but these multi-burn period fires, because you can't be there 24 hours. You've got all the knowledge. You've got a mental picture of the strategy and tactics of how you want this to go overall. And that communication line, it's kind of like a transition between a team and a Type 3 IC, a lot of that, when you have multi-burn period prescribed fires or fire use events, that getting that information, and it's happened to me too, transferring that information to the person that has a day shift or the night shift. This is the overall strategy here. You know, we'll say it in the shift plan, but we're never as detailed as it is in our head. And to be able to communicate that well enough, that's a tough thing to do.
Especially when you only have that little bit of overlap.
Yeah.
And when we only saw each other for like 2 or 3 hours each day. And it was basically a nighttime ignition, all day holding. And, you know, the communication was not as good as it could have been.
You know, one of the things that I've done fire behavior for the last 10 years, and one of the things I've always wondered about is that we needed an avenue to take the lessons we've learned from every fire that we've had and prescribed fire, what I was thinking, we needed a website where every FBAN or every fire use manager that sees things that have developed that surprise them could put, you know how at the end of a fire, we always do a fire summary and a fire narrative, and the summary is a one-page deal about how the fuels reacted to those conditions, you know. But this particular center may be a good place for where when you were surprised, because I mean I've been surprised, we've all been surprised, and to me it's just a lack of experience, because we haven't experienced those particular things, but we're all doing it, and if it would get put somewhere that burn managers and fire behavior analysts could go there and see how particular fires reacted in different fuel models for that time of the year, would go to these fires and have a better idea of what's happening. We have our fire behavior service centers, and they're kind of describing what's going on. But I think that those people, those fire use managers, or those prescribed, those burn bosses that have had problems or they've seen things, it would be a good place to go. And it could be just a two-liner, you know, about, you know, this is exactly what you just described. This was something that surprised me in this particular fuel model, that it stayed alive for 2 months in a PJ fuel model, which would be really surprising. And we had a fire on the Coconino in 2000 that was a pile that stayed lit for 4 months. Got stuck in a pine stump, and the roots went forever, came up in mid-May during one of our worst drought conditions and took off. I mean, just things like that are just really surprising, but I think this Lessons Learned Center would be a good place to put those kind of things just for us to read quickly and get us up to speed on what's going on in a particular region or something, so.
Yeah, how about fire use events? You guys did a lot of, I don't know, you guys did, how many fire use events this
This
summer?
year, I think we had 7 on the forest. I think we had 6 of them going at one time in August through the end of the fire season. Actually, the one was still showing slow or small fire movement, but up till we ended up getting some moisture in sort of the season-ending event, the second season-ending event, because we had an inch of rain in first part of September or more that pretty much squenched things, and then as things dried out again, like we've been experiencing the last 4 or 5 years with the droughts and stuff, that we go in this prolonged season, and with the condition of the fuels and that, even though with that much moisture, and the starting point of the fuel moisture is that it just dried out again over time, over a couple week period, and that, and I think, I think one of the things I've learned, or I'm still learning on fire use things, we're trying to the balance of fire use and still maintaining suppression action on other fires on the unit, and that's one thing with us is to with the complexity of the fires we're trying to do, fire use fires, and what you're ending up with collateral things because of the workforce and the demands of the suppression actions across the country, depending on what planning level we're on, and the needs of that to make that program work. And I think probably some of our success this year was we did bring in a fire use team on one of our fires on the south end of the forest. It wasn't a real complex fire, but just with our workload in that, we were able to talk the region and, well, not talk them, but I mean, plead our case to get a fire use team in to do the stage 3 for us, to take that burden off our workforce. And then the plan was to, once they got the stage 3 done, if the fire was still within, good operating prescriptions and whatever, we would manage the fire again, but have that plan in place in case it developed problems, and we would just implement the plan as the time was needed. In the meantime, we ended up with fires on the north end of the forest. We had 3 wilderness areas, so we ended up with I think 2 fires in wilderness area in the north of Grand Teton Park. Had 2 fire use fires, new fires that they had, and so we just talked to the Grand Teton. They were considering fire use for their fires, and ours, we did the stage 1 and stage 2s, and we were thinking of how we were going to manage it. And that time we weren't thinking of a stage 3, but then one of the fires got real active real quick and went to like 1,000 acres in an afternoon. So we worked with a fire use team and brought them up to do talk to them about complexing our fires with Grand Teton National Park. We had a total of, I think, 4 fires at that time on the north end of the forest. And so they were more than willing to come up. They had about a week of time left to do some of the assessments and look at that. And we figured right at that one time we needed stage 3 plan for the one fire, and the others we would just look at and do an assessment, maintain them within the stage 2 of that. So we worked with the team, and they decided to come up, and were very willing and worked with us quite a bit. And so then after that, or a few days later, I guess, we had another fire that started adjacent to one of our fires we included in the Caribou-Targhee forest to the west of the Bridger Teton and Grand Teton Park. Had a fire use fire they were wanting to manage, and that, so we worked with the team, and just with that communication with the 3 units and that, we're able to manage all these fires. So at the one time in our area we had I don't know 6 or 7 fires being managed at once, which is sort of a, I don't know, benchmark for our area, I think, in that. And
That's one of the interesting things to me is when you get these, and you have it too, Greg, you have these fire use events, you have teams all over the place, and it's not necessarily a prescribed fire manager or a fire use manager role, but it's a program manager. How you're prioritizing those, how you're playing the phone game and trying to parse out that workload. There's a lot of balls to be kept in the air and line officers to be kept informed on, okay, what's the priority here? We're looking at fire use there. Is it a go, no go? This team's, doing good or not good. Trying to prioritize that and keep that flow of information to those multiple levels and then back up to our supervisors. It's tough to do, and it's an art.
But I agree with Rod. You start getting bumped up. We had probably 5 fire use fires and in the Frank and then SAP, so we called up a team. Plus we had 4 or 5 type 2 teams through just on wildfire. I think for future planning, I think that's the way of doing business is fire use team to get you through stage 3. We the team we called up, we worked with the Salmon Chalice. Okay, they had a couple on them that they threw in with our fire use team that we had hired on. So I think that's a good way of doing business.
So one of the key things, I guess, when you get multiple fires or multiple types of incidents is that communication and talking to the neighbors and to the higher ups and saying help and knowing when that trigger is. And from what I've seen, it's mainly just a conversation with folks. Either your peers or your supervisors saying, okay, this is what we got going on. How are we feeling about this? What do we need to do next? Is it call a team, call the neighbors?
success is, I guess, too, of the fire program, I guess, in our neck of the woods is when we're gonna have fires that are gonna accomplish what we're trying to accomplish with the fire use, they're gonna be during the middle of the summer, during the fire season, when a lot of the other forests are really hot and heavy, the lower elevation forests and the high Rocky Mountains there, and our fuel types and that, typically for any significance fire, it's gonna be, in end of August and September, when a lot of the other
Level 5, yeah.
planning level 5, otherwise they just don't materialize into anything. And the key thing to a successful program is to be able to manage both sides of it, whether you're a fire use manager on a small one and still doing the duty officer stuff, dealing with suppression, that you can't forget about the wildland fire use fire. You need to put the same importance on that. I guess the key thing as a fire use manager is have the backing from your line officers to make that program a success and be willing to take some of the risks with you.
Well, I think the one thing I saw that I'm going to put a lot of importance on is how your fire management plans are laid out. That's key. I mean, that to me is monumental of importance. Is how you describe your land base, so that when that decision comes, you just sit down with your line officers and you say, "This is where we're at." You can initiate it, and then to convince them too, if politically within a region, I don't know how the rest of the Park Service, but the Forest Service, yeah, you're in planning level 5, the rest of the country's burning, you might get a regional forester decision to say, no, we're not going to let you go fire use. Well, then it's above and beyond you, but at least you have made those decisions on your unit to take care of all of those, but without that fire management plan laid out real well for basis, I think you're behind the power curve. But
We actually had to elevate ours to the national macro to do burning in planning level 5, and they were okay with it because of what was going on in Region 3. But
yeah, we were good this year too.
We had to go to the national office.
We went national too. So this year was good. A little different political atmosphere, I guess. The year before was a little hard, I guess, due to some things.
I think that a lot of it is just that support, that kind of interagency, and that's what helps us at Grand Teton is everybody, they start worrying. Yellowstone had a lot of fires. There's still a lot of initial attack, and being able to kind of look across and say, okay, between all of us, we can do this, and we have managers. I mean, we divided and conquered fires between all 3 or both forests and the park, and just kind of who can do it. Okay, who can help in this area? Somebody else had a team commitment. They're going to be leaving, so who can cover for them? And that definitely was a lot of help, and that helped our line officers to see that we were looking at the big picture, because that was the first question. Well, isn't there a lot going on here? Do we really want to do this? And it's like, well, there is a lot going on, but we're not going to reach our objectives unless we do it this time of year. If we wait till September, they're not gonna go anywhere. And then something that helped us a lot is relying on past documents that were done, that were completed on fires, you know, some of the projections that were done. So I didn't have to try to stay up till 3 in the morning doing a rewrap run, but I could pull out and say, okay, this fire was 3 miles away. It was 3 weeks later, and look at what was predicted for it. You know, in order to get there, it's gonna have to burn through these other fire scars, and looking at our fire history maps, you know, put that on the table, because we actually got a no on one of the fires that, you know, I was very much disagreed with, but once I showed them, okay, look at the predictions that were done in 2000, same kind of scenario in terms of conditions for a 2 week later period, then at least they could kind of see something and be able to base a better decision, and we converted it to a yes. And in the end, the fire didn't go anywhere, just as we kind of said, but it took some convincing to try to teach them, and it was nice to have that information to fall back on. And I'm sure, you know, in the future, Rod will be using his. I mean, we used the Enos fire, which was very near one of his fires. Now he's got another, you know, stage 3 projection that was done in that same area, and that it just all helps to be able to educate and show people what you're doing and why you're doing it. Because otherwise, they kind of look at you like, oh, you're just being gung ho. It's like, well, no, I don't want to beat up our employees either, and we're all tired too. But we have to look at it in terms of what if we say we have a fire use program, we need to do it. And then secondly, we need to look at each fire individually and not just say, yeah, but so-and-so has a big fire. It's like, well, they do, but we have to look at our fire and make that decision. And we learned a lot this year on why we need to kind of have our ducks in a row when we go into the administrators to make sure that they're comfortable too.
I sort of had the opposite concern with one particular line officer, in that they saw it as, we have fire use, we have to do it almost. And unfortunately, I was gone on a team assignment, but he had a natural start right next to a timber sale, right next to a developed campground. And it doesn't mean we can't do it, but we were at prep level 4, bumping 5. And he made the call without even really having a fuma there to do it. We're gonna do fire use here. And I had to call back, because the local FMO said, you know, this is not a good fire use time, and call back and say, you know, there's a lot of reasons, like about 5 of them, that no, you shouldn't consider that. He was just looking at what he saw in this ponderosa pine type in this little like 5-acre patch, and I was like, you know, think about conditions this year, think about over that ridge. This thing it's like July, it's going to go for, you know, I have more concern, at least locally, with this gung-ho attitude from the line officers about everything's fire use.
A couple of things I want to capture real quick that I've heard, good stuff. The SAA, the situational awareness, especially multiple incidents, it's nothing you can put ever in a fire management plan. And it's something you've got to be able to learn how to do, be able to talk to your neighbors, be able to get that intelligence, to be able to have an effective large or a multiple incident program. The other one I heard was history. Using history so you don't have to reinvent the wheel totally, that you've got it there available to you so you can pull it out of a file or an FMU description or, you know, potentially a fire management plan. What did we find out 2 years ago, 10 years ago that applies to this situation? And then the other one, it's personality is involved in the decision-making process. It's part of situational awareness is, you know, if you've got someone that's makes different decisions than especially your supervisor would be making, then that's something to keep an eye on. It's part of that situational awareness.
And part of that rapport, so that you can go back and forth and say, well, not sure that's a good idea, and these are the reasons why. That comfort level to be able to sit down and negotiate or discuss, I guess, before that decision's totally made.
Yeah, I really like the part about history that I hadn't thought about before, that how to take the stuff that we've done in the past. You know, we've got something similar going on now. How do they play into one? Is it a totally different set of circumstances, or is it very similar? Yeah. And what do we do then that we do now? It's a lesson learned that you probably have in a file in your desk someplace, and if you had it accessible and triggered yourself to use it like you did, it's effective stuff.
And giving others access, because my forest is extremely embryonic in its fire development stage and fuels, and I don't have a history of fire use, large fires. We haven't had a type 1 incident until 2002 on that forest, and I had the access to some of your history. We'd have to do some, you know, adjusting for your conditions, but you know, I have no history to base any decisions on that forest.
So you have to reinvent the wheel.
Yeah.
And I think that's I guess, to go on that a little bit longer, that's a key point, I think, is just that documentation, because, and, you know, which helped us, what Lisa talked about on a lot of those fires, where we got a lot of this information, was in the year 2000, when we weren't doing fire use, but we had significant fires, and the only teams we could get to manage those were fire use teams. And they still, because they were either in the wilderness, and we weren't gonna get resources or on the edge of wilderness, we had them basically do an implementation plan, so if the priority bumped up, we knew what we had to do and when we had to do it, just like you would with a fire use fire. And those teams, I mean, they provide that documentation. And I remember, you know, one of my first fires where I originally went as the LTAN and then ended up being the fire use manager. And I guess we're not supposed to, it's not blame or anything, but it's on a pay at force and that. And because they had a good program going, they had a big fire use program in the Frank Church. And it was just looking at the levels of those programs and what the expectations were for those fire use. And at the time, these fire use teams were coming in, and there's a lot of glitz, a lot of PowerPoints, a lot of computer programs, all this hocus pocus stuff. And you know, with Farsight, I mean, Farsight wasn't even thought of then, but rewrap and all that. And so a lot of these teams were promoting that and what this can do to help give you an idea of the risks in that. But then you have forests that they have good programs and solid programs in that, but they keep the documentation part a little bit lower key, you know, and that's a struggle where you try to do, you know, just sort of a narrative report of day-to-day processing of what you want and what the forest expects from you in that. And by not sharing, I mean back into lessons learned and that information sharing, by that you don't put that effort into collecting all that information and stuff. You can get overload, but you know, the appropriate much will help you down the road. And I guess that's the point I'm trying to make.
Well, and some other stuff we've talked about is trying to game out some of the fires that we said no to. Can we do some projections on them in the winter? So that then we can say, okay, what would have happened with this fire, and maybe use that. And yeah, it's still just gaming it out. But hopefully, you know, if we went through the scenario and watched what the weather did for the rest of the season, we may be able to game out what would have happened with that fire and be able to talk about it in reference, you know. And trying to find the time to do that is always difficult, but it's something, it'd be, right.
Something less than a success based on if we said yes
Right.
rather than no. Yeah.
Well, it might be
It just-
part of the success, because I think, you know, this applies, even though it's with fire use, when we get into more and more landscape burning, we can use those same experiences on fire use fires into prescribed fire on fire in landscape type projects.
There's no difference. I mean, you know, you get into your land management plans, and some of these areas are gonna be fire uses allowed, some not because of where it lays, and some it's gonna be, yeah, absolutely, it's wilderness, you know? So you have some calls. So I mean, it's the same thing if you're outside of a wilderness on a plan where, you know, you can let, you know, fire use go, and you're doing this because of weather or where it's heading. You know, what's the difference between the run there if the run's in the forest? That's the same. It's the same information, you know.
One of the toughest things I think on fire use is a lot of the areas we're getting them now, we haven't ever seen burn under a normal regime. You know, we've always either you caught them at a single tree or a tenth of an acre, or they went big. So you really don't, you know, and to me it's really important to keep your eyeballs on it, to see how it's acting diurnally, to see how it's acting on different aspects. Because you don't really have much to go from unless you had a multi-burn period escape fire to watch and see how that fuel type would burn. Especially the high elevation stuff that you get. I mean, you don't get them that often, so to try to calibrate your mind on what the fire is going to do, it's tough. And the models are the models, and it gives you a benchmark or somewhere to shoot for, but all of us have got to calibrate what we're seeing in fire behavior to help make those risk decisions.
Well, the main thing, I mean, you can have all that stuff, but the thing that's gonna make a success of that is the unknown, and it's the unknown of we don't know what's gonna happen the next week with the weather and stuff like, there's a lot of things you do know, fuel conditions and that, but the weather stuff and that is just one of those things that you can't predict, you know. Even the weather service guys, after 3 or 5 days, they're not gonna guarantee anything.
I'm curious, worst case scenario, both prescribed burning and fire use. And everybody has their own idea of how far to go geographically, maybe for a worst case scenario and what you plan for. To me, you know, when I review burn plans anymore, it's one of the things that, I'm looking for a contingency plan. So a contingency plan to meet what sort of event? Now, one of the fires we had ran 5 miles in an afternoon. Do we ever plan for that fire to do that? Did we think it would based on the fuels? No. Can you? I mean, where do you plan for that? I mean, how do you plan in there to be effective? It's still a question for me.
Goes back to documentation. And you guys have documented those weather conditions and the drought conditions, all that has to get thrown together now for the next time, we have to be using that kind of information to make because like you said, you were surprised, and those are the kind of things that would be really good to keep in the lessons learned library, so that someone could go back and say, okay, we're in this kind of conditions, what were the fires that gave us problems this year, and under those conditions.
I agree with you. One of the questions I asked about that, though, okay, so this weather event was probably the 97th or above percentile of it happening. So I'm going in and I'm reviewing this burn plan tomorrow for complex burn. Am I looking for that 97th, above the 97th, to plan for a contingency? I'm looking for.
You never burn.
Yes. So where do you shoot for, and how do you think about those sort of things?
Well, that was a question we had on the cherry fire this year that turned we moved it into a wildland fire. And their runs in that brush fuel model were at 400 chains an hour at the 97th percentile.
See ya.
Well, yeah, and they had an escape. And a type 1 team was put on it. And so my question was, were you really in prescription? Because your contingency forces could not possibly, you need a type 1 team there to match the contingency force. So what they did was, they went in and burned, put the black, burned out the lines so that spotting potential was, the predicted spotting was, was at a level, the black was at a level which spots couldn't stay ignited past that, it was beyond the predicted spotting level. But they had a little finger of fuel within 3 chains of the line that didn't burn in the initial blackout. And the day they lit the fire, it did perfect. The next day, it got into that little finger that nobody knew about. Got into a bunch of dead ponderosa pine trees, spotted one off, and away it went, And but they met they had documented in the burn plan that this black would be their holding line and that it couldn't spot beyond that. But I asked them, but if you were burning, because they had done some burning without black line, I said, with those kinds of rates of spread, how could you possibly ignite that without the contingency forces to deal with it, And so I think it's you're right. There's a lot of these things that are going to show that you can't do it, but you've got to put those mitigating measures in there to, I know we're all doing it, but it's, the burn boss has to make sure that all his bases are covered. Why is that not going to happen at the 97th percentile if they are burned? Because they were burned at the 99th percentile.
Yeah, one of the things, for an individual 1-day burn, you can pretty much set it up. You light it, you're within, this is what the rate of spread's going to be in the adjacent fuels. I've got the resources to cut it off. But then, like yours, like the one you talked about 3 days later, a few months later, then you've got this, is it an effect of how you mop it up so it is a multi-day burn? Or if you have to have a multi-day burn, how do you think about that over time? Is there a time threshold that you cut it off because you won't be able to catch the fire if it does something, you put the whole thing out? Those are the kind of questions that I've asked myself, especially on multi-burn period prescribed fires.
Well, especially with your situation, Brent, that was like a month or more after the burn was completed, and so how do you plan for those unexpected? And that ties back to doing, landscape scale type stuff, because when you can't mop the whole thing up, can't put it all out, and there's the unknowns of it.
That's part of the risk of doing business. We have to, and our region has told us that they'll stand behind us on those kinds of things that we don't have control over. It's kind of like this escape that happened, everything the burn went according to plan, and we had something crazy happen. And those are the kind of things I think we can't plan for that. We couldn't, no way could we afford to even try to plan for something like that. Those kind of things are going to happen, and we're going to lose a few. But as long as we're in prescription when we do it, and we've done everything we can to hold on to it, we're covered. And those kind of things are going to happen. And if we try not to do those kinds of things because of the potential for that, we'll get nothing done.
I guess I'll say, you could figure all that plan in there, but it's still that probability that something different can happen. And when we're dealing with some of the environment we're dealing in, I mean, we can do exactly plan for what happened at Sanford and that, but then the next fire, we do exactly that. You could have something, the same outcome because of some other difference. So you're gonna have that risk. I think that's, I mean.
So this brings up the question, should all multi-burn period fires be complex? Because we all light fires and they're in prescription. The next day, you know, prescription, I mean, if it's still skunking around out there, we don't follow that, and if it goes outside of prescription, we put it out. So does that automatically lend itself to a complex fire? Well, I mean, our
Something.
system doesn't do that now.
I think it's something to ask because, you know, Sanford was a month and a half after the fact, and then it came out. You know, you'd have to be some pretty good long-range planner. And I think, personally, just from my observations, I've been in this a long time, this drought and some of the weather conditions that have been happening to us are just incredible. We had and this is on the suppression side, but to give you an idea, we had a shelter deployment on the Price Canyon fire here 2 years ago. And, you know, jumpers fly over it, they see a big plateau. And to the east, there's 2 canyons, 2 bowls going up. And right on the east, where this plateau breaks to the west, or I mean to the south, there was a good rocky ridge. So they said, okay, and there's a road down there, and these 2 bowls were blowing out. And so they said, okay, we'll jump on this road, we'll burn an anchor in, we'll use that road, and then we'll figure out how to take it back to the south. Okay, so on a minuscule part, those jumpers in that plane, they covered their LCES. They got on the ground, they burned a little safety zone, they start burning to the north, and a couple guys start burning to the south to try to pick this up. All of a sudden, this fire did come around the corner, and it did take out this basin. This whole basin went. Now we're talking sagebrush, very little sagebrush, mostly grass. Punches up a big column. Well, as the back, what the weather folks figure, and fire behavior, as the back cooled off, the column collapsed. When it collapsed on this plateau, it sent, you know, 45, 60-mile winds at these folks. And because of what the black was there, it basically turned into nighttime. They couldn't, you know, 3 of them couldn't get back to the safety zone. Now, what I described here, I mean, I've been in this game for a long time. Now, am I missing the point that when, you know, that these folks should have predicted a collapsing column behind? I mean, we're talking such outrageous fire behavior that, you know, yet I think they covered their bases. So there's a lesson learned for you that can happen. Sanford's a lesson learned that a month and a half later you can have 60, 70-mile-an-hour winds that coming out of a good luck. I mean, what I'm saying is some of this is so far out at the edge. Now, some people can sit back and second guess this and say, well, you should have. But they're not the one in our spots having to plan that out. And like you said, you are in prescription a week before the day of the burn and maybe a couple weeks after. But when you got a couple thousand acres on fire,
Getting back to the prescribed fire and along multi-burn period sort of things, it seems like they turn into a hybrid of fire use, wildland fire use, and prescribed fire. Because you need the skills to be able to look at long-term fire. If you have a multi-burn period fire, you need to know, you know, do some projections, rewrap whatever you've got. Look at the weather conditions once you get into multi-burn periods.
They also almost turn into type 3 incidents, because all of a sudden you've got logistics, you got sleeping quarters, you got food, you got a lot more to deal with. And I guess complexity in terms of aerial ignition may not be there, but it sure as heck is in terms of all the other stuff you're dealing with. I mean, you're almost a type 3 incident at that point, because there's so much coming and going, and night shift, and somebody to monitor it, and somebody to be out there first thing in the morning to come in, and you need a briefing every day, and a IAP every day. And I mean, the whole complexity changes, and I don't think it should, you know, I think you do need to look at that, and it potentially is a type 1 burn boss because of that kind of stuff, because there's so much other big picture, you know, agency administrators you need to be talking to, and everything else.
Situational awareness with IA going on.
Right.
But we don't. I mean, in the end, I don't have a copy with me, but the NWCG complexity analysis does not talk about multi-burn period fires and how that affects, but we all know it's true. So maybe that's something I'm gonna maybe even add into our fire management plan, that automatically any multi-burn period fires that we're planning on, especially landscape, to allow it to move under its own accord. To natural barriers is another one that should be rated as complex, period.
And we do that sometimes, we'll bump it up for those reasons, because there's just too many other things that we just say, this is not a type 2. We need to have either burn boss type 1 at scene, or that's kind of the mentor with that burn boss type 2. I mean, just because it's
That's
like you
how
start,
we would
you
do it.
start doing the addition and the math, and yeah, the complexity analysis might not be there, but you start looking at the complexity of the whole thing, and we just say,
So
we're gonna
maybe
bump it
having
up
hard
one.
and fast in a plan isn't, it sounds like you got a type 2 plus sort of
Right.
thing going on, rather than setting, but then it takes somebody when they're reviewing the plan or approving it to know that, okay, it says it's intermediate, but it's actually intermediate plus, so we need some other skills there. Who does that for you? When you guys review burn plans, do you recognize that and actually step it up, or?
We're doing it in the burn plan review process, and then we have Andy or Rod will usually be our technical reviewer, and sometimes it's nice because they'll point out something else that we maybe didn't. But as the person that wrote the burn plan, I as the FMO, several of us kind of end up doing, we do a debriefing about that plan before we actually get it signed by everybody, and that's kind of, sometimes we'll put it right in the plan. Because of this reason, we're gonna move this up to a type 1 burn plan.
Because I hate to put
Or
more
burn
policy
boss.
in. You know, these
Right.
guys hate me for putting more policy in our fire management plans, but
Right.
doing those things that we need to be doing and a trigger to make sure we are doing them. You know, maybe something about consider every multi-burn period fire as complex and take that in consideration during approval. You hate to have those triggers that it is or it isn't, because they always don't fit.
I got lessons learned on that one, and it wasn't, well, but you witnessed some of that this year when I was on the Payette. And we had hall fire, and they were calling that fire in, and the FMO was calling me, and we're in the war room, and we're talking, and he says, yeah, it's 40 acres, he says, I think we're gonna need a team, and I'm thinking, boy, you know, that's just gonna cape that ridge, it's gonna be back in the wind shadow in there, and it's gonna be on the north slope. Yeah, okay, I'm not gonna second guess him, you know, and just right off the spur, we went and launched the type 2 team, yep, call them a team, right? And down the road a day or two after this thing is highway and or the possibilities with power line and everything else, boy, I'll tell you what, if I'd gone to type 1 complexity, that's probably what we should have launched. You know, you didn't want to spend the money, but what I'm saying is just like you are, you go through that and you're sitting there thinking, boy, I don't want to complicate this for this guy, and we probably won't have to use it, but that one time out of 10 that you'll need to, well, it sure is comfortable to say you had done the documentation, you ran through a complexity analysis, and even though you knew it wasn't going to run that hard, you did it, you know.
Yeah.
So I think that has relevance back to what you're saying is, you know, not, you know, it looks like a type 2 burn, but well, maybe it's going to be a couple, 3 days, and maybe it's going to be this, and so you kick it up to a type 1.
It's that critical thinking as we do the decision process. You know, it's not just what the paper says, because we all fill out the papers, but think about what it means and how the situational awareness is when you go into it. And it's tough. To me, I learned it by watching folks, you know, on how they go through a process or paying attention to other people and see what things that they're thinking about as they go through this situational awareness. That's the only way I learned it, and I still learning it on how to do it. But that observation, you know, what was Rod taking into account when he had all of those fires going on whether he was going to get a fire use team or something else to manage it? Was it fire use team? You know, those sort of things. Were you going to say so?
Well, I just say, you know, I don't know that we need policy to determine that. I think, like has been brought up, I think that fire use manager, or that burn boss, or whoever is in charge should be able to recognize that, you know, it's gone to the next step up, and then they should be going to that step, going to a type 1 or whatever they needed to do, and so.
And it takes a lot of times, say a burn boss or fire use manager or somebody that's got their head down looking at this, what do they call it, target fixation, that if you don't have a program manager or somebody kind of looking at the bigger picture, say, hey, you know, how about this thing over here that's coming at you from this way? If that's invisible or not effective, you know, we've all seen it, that something breaks down, and something bad can break down when that's not happening.
That's one of the hard things, I guess, to learn when you're, like, for becoming a burn boss or what, is you can't be on the project. I mean, you got to be on the project, but you can't be having the torch in your hand or the shovel in your hand. You got to be looking at, you know, the surrounding and the situation around you. And I guess I see that, you know, in some of the close calls or some of the escapes in that is that you are getting focused on one aspect of the job and not paying attention to everything else going on. And I think, and that's hard for people to learn as they're taking on those roles in that, and that's one of the things that, you know, I've you try to do when you see that happening, whether it's with when you're on a burn and then you got the ignition specialist, and the first thing they do is pick up a drip torch and start lighting, you go, time out, that's not your job. Your job's to watch how that lighting crew's doing and what they're doing in that. And that's one of the things that I think, I see that we fall into sometimes when we have problems and all.
Let me summarize real quick some of the stuff that I've learned. Information is a big key part of our fire use and prescribed fire events that maybe it escapes me sometimes, and I need to pay more attention to. It sounds like everybody echoed that it's a big part of the job that maybe isn't as highlighted as some of the more other things. The complexity of multiple burn period fires and what that means, and all the situational awareness that goes along with that. Complexity of multiple incidents and how you handle that, keeping situational awareness with your neighbors, with your supervisors, things like that. History and how important that can be to help you stay above the curve while you're making these decisions. Keep that little history box right there, so if it's applicable, pull it out and use it. Personalities involved in decision making. That's another one of the situational awareness, one of the big ones. Whether it's folks implementing, supervisors, decision makers, and how that goes. And the final one, which is a good summary, is keeping your head up, whether you're doing wildland fire use or prescribed fire, complex prescribed fire, or non-complex. That keeping your head up, keeping the big picture there is real important. Anything else I missed?
I think, it ties to all that, I think, is managing the unknown. Being able to adapt to the unknown, that's what's gonna happen. And part of that is, I think part of planning and that whole thing is, and it all, to me, comes down to this is, yeah, we go in and we develop these plans, and we're gonna implement this plan and we're gonna have a success. You gotta be thinking about these things that that are unknown and that may happen, and how you're gonna deal with it at that time, and be prepared, I guess. Be prepared as well as you can, because you don't know what's gonna happen.
So I'm just throwing this out, just something I would like some feedback on, is, we're talking about the unknown as far as weather and specific things and tactics, and I guess I'm curious what others feel about it. I think the biggest unknown, and it relates to personalities, is our somewhat inability or discomfort at this point in time to deal with human factors, because that seems to be, at least what I've kind of seen, that's the big if thing that always seems to affect the decisions. I think we got tactics and strategies and all that stuff down fairly well, but we're still struggling with human factors, how people deal with this information and knowledge that they have, stress situations, decision making. And I was also related to human factors, I was kind of curious if others think, like, what was that fatality they had? I think it was on the reservation in
Down in Arizona this year.
yeah, and the Buchanan thing, and I'm just kind of curious if perhaps there's not a human factor thing involved with prescribed fires, with a slightly different take on people out there on a prescribed fire. Like, had that been a wildfire, do you think that guy would have done that same thing, would have gone out by himself, what turned into the head of the fire? Or because it was a prescribed fire, people maybe are cutting a little bit of shaving their awareness. Yeah,
Not
you
be
know, so
hazardous. You're not getting HPA.
Which
so.
brings up a good point that I think they've been trying to push that you should be getting HPA.
I don't know if that plays into human factors or not, but legitimately, you're getting HPA, it must be hazardous. If you're not, it must not be hazardous. I understand why they do it, but yeah, it's a good point.
Does anybody else
I think you're
sense that a little bit?
I think you're right. I think sometimes we call on the troops for prescribed burn, and everybody, okay, there's containment lines. We're just gonna, get this thing done, and we've really tried to put some emphasis on thorough briefings, and we actually even do an IAP to make sure that everybody really understands what's going on out there, because I think we've all been out on prescribed fires. Oh, you have ignition coils? Cool. Take this fire. We're going to start over there, and and you're like, okay, and so I just think it's really important, and we've tried to put a lot of emphasis on it, and hopefully it's been successful. I think people have felt pretty good about the briefings that they've gotten because of that. Because I've been on way too many where it's like, who's who, and who's in charge, and who's running that engine, and you don't ever really know exactly, and you all just start heading out to do the right thing because this is a planned event, and you know, everybody just assumes everybody knows it, and I think it's a bad assumption we get into, and,
That
you know,
IEP, that's a good idea, that would, because they would immediately kick them into the wildfire, all these
Right.
things apply.
and
It's
have
not-
something to
right.
reference back to, you
Right.
know, because they get that map, they see how we broke out the divisions, they see who's in charge of which division, and I just, it's, you know, and some people kind of laugh and, holy cow, they went to great extents, but what we found is it just is what helps us, because so many times, we don't know who's gonna be on that burn till we make the call and all the engines come in from all over, and maybe they're players we haven't worked with before, and so then we have to try to get them on the same page of who's, you know, what frequencies are we using and all that, and it was one way of just, it helped the burn boss to be able to brief and not feel so scattered when you're trying to relay so much information to so many different people.
Yeah, and all you really need is what the objectives, an org chart, and communication plan. And everybody will be flipped into that mode. Okay, this is what we're doing.
Exactly.
Everybody's on the same page. Yeah, that's good. That would help reinforce that human factors too, that this is the way we do business. It's not just we're going out and building a fence or something like that, that this has its consequences.
The hardest thing for us in Region 3 was to get people to start wearing fire shelters during prescribed fire, because we just never saw anything that was a problem, you know? And then now that we're in these drought conditions and stuff, we're seeing things that we don't normally see, but we're trying to, you know, hammer down that I don't care what it looks like, you have to have everything, you know, all your proper PPE and, you know.
We better wrap this up, I guess. Thanks.